It's not been a good week for Rupert Murdoch. First, a British parliamentary committee concluded he's unfit to run an international company. Then, a US senator stepped up efforts to find out if Murdoch's companies have broken US laws. Will the hacking scandal cross the Atlantic? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Rupert Murdoch presides over a massive media empire, but above all, he's said to be most passionate about his newspapers. And it's the conduct of those newspapers that's now threatening his hold over all that he's built. The scandal at Murdoch's British tabloid, The News of the World, has seen senior editorial figures arrested over revelations that police were bribed and that hundreds had their phones hacked, including a murdered schoolgirl and victims of the 7/7 bombings in London. This week, Britain's House of Commons Culture Committee delivered a damning verdict on Murdoch's stewardship of his British newspapers, concluding he exhibited willful blindness to what was going on. Now, a senior US senator has written to a second British inquiry convened as a result of the scandal and chaired by a senior judge. Senator Jay Rockefeller has asked if any evidence has come to light of American laws being broken. If so, Murdoch's troubles will only just be beginning. His British newspapers are but a small part of the News Corp international empire, which has its headquarters here in the US and includes iconic names like Fox and the Wall Street Journal. Let's start by having a listen to the verdict of Tom Watson, a senior member of that British Culture Select Committee.
In the view of the majority of committee members, Rupert Murdoch is not fit to run an international company like B-Sky-B.
So a little earlier, I spoke to Michael Price-Jones, senior policy analyst with Change to Win, a US group that advises pension funds with over $200 billion in assets, including holdings in News Corp. I asked him what effect that damning verdict of the British Parliamentary Committee had on shareholders.
I think it just confounded a lot of concerns that people already had, and it just upped the ante in terms of what investors need to do going forward. I think people really need to see the independent directors stand up and speak for them, not for the board at this point.
Although, I mean, it was noticed that the share price, in fact, went up in the aftermath of that parliamentary report.
I know.
Are you in the majority, or are you just part of that bloc who's always wanted to get rid of Murdoch?
No, I think at this point there's a vast majority of independent shareholders that want to move on with this board and get a new independent leadership there. In terms of the stock price, we saw a lot of reasons for that going up, and even the fact that this could be the eventual resolution of the issue with Murdoch stepping aside.
And you believe that will be the resolution, or you believe that that should happen?
It should happen. Whether it will happen quickly or it will take a long time from now really depends upon the independent directors.
Why should Rupert Murdoch step aside?
I think he's tainted, and I think it's pretty obvious now that he's bringing the scandal to the United States.
In what specific ways?
Well, the committee itself raised concerns about his leadership, and if Ofcom listens to that, that raises concerns about B-Sky-B's future, which will be a huge hit to News Corp shareholders.
So is that it? I mean, that's another suggestion, is that US shareholders might be using this as leverage, perhaps, to just get Murdoch to sell off all the newspapers in the UK, which they've never liked very much, but in the end they kind of still want Murdoch to be in charge.
I don't see that. They see these being good assets, perhaps, but they don't believe in Murdoch's leadership at this point.
But the point is you have no real clout because of the dual-class shareholder structure, so what can you do about it?
Well, I think you have to look at the independent shareholders, sorry, the independent directors. They have to be held accountable to all of this. They have reputations, they have credibility behind them, and they have to recognize their legacy as businessmen, as academics is on the line here.
But have you been in touch with those independent directors? Have you seen any meaningful change in their stance that might lead to the changes that you're advocating?
We have been in touch with them. A lot of investors have met with them independently. They haven't stood up. They've thrown their lot in with Murdoch, but we need to really keep pressing on them. That's the only leverage investors have.
But again, I mean, they did vote. They did give a vote of confidence to Murdoch. I mean, what optimism do you have? Are any wavering, as far as you know?
I think they will slowly realize that their credibility is on the line here. John Thornton, Rod Eddington, Viet Din, these are big name individuals who have to recognize that people are going to raise questions about their credibility elsewhere.
What effect then do you think would there be on News Corp if Rupert Murdoch stood aside?
I think it would be a positive. I think you could immediately go ahead and get an independent chairman from outside. You could promote Chase Carey on an interim basis whilst the board sorts out the rest of the issues going on, and then consider his future leadership long term.
So there's no respect at all for Rupert Murdoch, the man who built up this corporation, for the viability of News Corp in the future? You just don't need him anymore?
You know, shareholders have always kind of had a dubious or kind of a Faustian relationship with him. They've always accepted a kind of dynastic rule here for the kind of genius he has been. Remember, he did do a lot of good things, especially in the 90s, but over the last decade, he's really kind of stumbled, and investors have to question whether he's an asset or a liability at this point.
So is the US to be the next battleground between Rupert Murdoch and his opponents? We're joined from New York by Jess Todtfeld, a media consultant and ex-Fox News producer. In the studio, we have Paul Farhi, the Washington Post's media correspondent, and Jeremy Holden, research director for Media Matters. Paul Farhi, then, first of all, how widespread is that sort of disgruntlement we just saw amongst shareholders, you think?
I don't think it's widespread at all. I think that the market and the investors in the market are assuming that someday Rupert Murdoch will be gone, but the stock has been rising. They might like to see a change in management, not immediately and not suddenly, but I think they believe that there is greater shareholder value with a professional management in place instead of Rupert Murdoch. On the other hand, Rupert Murdoch is the man who built this company over 60 years. He is the genius entrepreneur who has created the billions in assets that News Corp has today. So
in fact, it's kind of win-win in the sense that perhaps they're hoping that Rupert Murdoch will stay, but his clout will be diminished within the company. Then.
That's right, and that there will be more rational and less emotional management of this company. That is to say that if something needs to be sold, if something needs to be bought, it will be done so on less of an individual basis and more of a group committee basis, as corporations tend to do.
But Jeremy Holden, what about this idea of reputational damage, not just of Rupert Murdoch, but also then by implication of the independent directors of News Corp? Can they handle that?
I think that's a great question, and I think that you talk about reputational damage. I think that the findings of this report are devastating throughout News Corp. You know, the idea that an investigation concluded that Rupert Murdoch was unfit to lead a global media company. That finding is not limited to the holdings in the UK, but it extends throughout the company, just as we've seen the kind of culture of corruption itself extend throughout the company.
But do you feel that, is there any sense, actually, as our guest was saying, that independent directors are now weighing what this means for their reputation? Actually, perhaps, Paul Farhi, you might be more in the loop on this.
I think the board supports Murdoch. I think your guest exaggerates the degree of dissension in that board. Clearly, the company is, they've gotten their attention, they're nervous, but they are doing damage control, and I don't see any sign whatsoever that the board is ready to pitch Murdoch over the side.
Nonetheless, Jess Todtfeld, there is this sense that Murdoch, he's not essential necessarily to News Corp. Is that the sense you're getting? He still has that genius, that flair. No matter whether you like him or not, he does seem to give the people what they want. But in the end, his position has been questioned, hasn't it?
It has over the years, but I think there's always this question mark of who would come in and who would be able to fill those shoes. If he can get past this speed bump, and I think he can, his position within the company may be diminished or may be lessened, but if he can get past this, I think he will continue doing what he's doing.
All right, well, let's look at this speed bump, as you put it then. We have, here in the US, certainly, we have these FBI investigations, Department of Justice investigations. What are they actually looking at the moment?
There's two things they're looking at. One is the question of bribery. Did anyone in England, in Great Britain, pay off police, and does this run afoul of the American law, the anti-bribery statute? Here. The other question is, were phones hacked in the United States? did the same thing that occurred in Great Britain occur here as well? So far, not much evidence for that, and that's the real question that all of the American investigators are looking into.
What about Senator Jay Rockefeller's congressional inquiries now?
Yeah, I think that keeps the question open. And we talk about whether Rupert Murdoch can get past the speed bump. I don't know that we've seen where the speed bumps are and how many speed bumps there are down the road. There's already 5 companies under News Corp that have been implicated in some way in criminal wrongdoing. Some of that has been settled. 50 people connected to this in the UK have been arrested. And so to the extent that shareholders or the board is waiting for Rupert Murdoch to get past the speed bump, it's already cost the company, by some estimates, $200 million to this point. How much more is it going to take to get past the existing speed bumps that we don't even know how high those are going to be once they're erected?
And given the British Parliamentary Committee's verdict that he's simply not fit, that the culture permeated from the top and so forth, doesn't the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, have certain statutes which have to be looked at as well? You know, the idea that broadcast frequencies must be run by firms, by people of good character and serve public interest, speak with candor. Are these not coming into play now as well?
They are theoretically, but in practice they are not. The FCC considers American standards, not the sense of a parliamentary
Well, isn't good
committee.
character good character?
Well, it has to be a finding of fact based on American evidence, and so far there is no such finding of fact. Not to defend Murdoch, but the FCC went through a proceeding in the mid-90s in which his licenses to control the Fox TV stations were challenged. The FCC basically found that he was fit and proper at that point. There are new facts here, no question, but we've seen 0 that officially count as far as the FCC, which, by the way, has very, very rarely, perhaps 3 or 4 times in its entire history of 70-plus years, taken away a license from anyone.
Well, Rupert Murdoch seems to think some damage has been done, at least. Here's what he said about the scandal just a few days ago.
Some newspapers are closer to my heart than others, but I also have to say that I failed. I think that historically, this whole business of the News of the World is a serious blot on my reputation.
Jess Todtfeld, I suppose the point is, prima facie, I suppose there are concerns. The question, I suppose, is, it was happening over there. Why should we believe it's not happening over here? This culture of running the newspapers, of doing anything by any means necessary, of getting the stories and so forth. You're a veteran of Fox News. Tell us, I mean, does that culture extend here?
It's not anything I ever saw, and obviously there are investigators who will look into that. But in interviews that I've done since this whole thing came out, the answer that I've pretty much given is it didn't even occur to us to do this type of thing, phone hacking and going that distance to try to get the story. If anything, my take on the current state of U.S. journalism across the board is that enough isn't being done and questions and all that, but certainly not to this extent. So, like I said, I mean, it didn't even occur to us until I heard this story. It was so far off my radar. Then again, look, you know, the investigators will do their thing, and you know, hopefully for him and for the company, they don't find anything. It was isolated to this, just to the UK in this one case.
But Paul Farhi?
You have to understand the differences in the media culture between Great Britain and the United States. We certainly like scoops in American media, but we don't live and die by them quite the same way as the British tabloids do and have done for centuries. Fox News doesn't break news in the sense of scandal and doesn't break news in the sense that the News of the World was doing. It is more of a political media outlet.
What about the New York Post, though?
The New York Post is more following the cops and following the crime of New York City. That its selling point isn't quite the same salaciousness as News of the World or The Sun is in Britain.
Jeremy Holden, would you agree with that?
I think we're talking about some of the illegality at this point, and what we see with Fox News, and you know, to the extent that this unfitness to lead and the willful blindness turns, we certainly see efforts. You know, we know that people high up in Fox News have made, you know, decisions to try and slant the news, sometimes dishonestly. We have, you know, the Washington managing director acknowledging as much, you know, during a cruise ship. So while these things might not cross a legal boundary, I think questions remain whether they cross an ethical boundary. And to the extent we're talking about whether the leadership at the top has a lack of fitness issue, I think we have to start talking about the content that's put out there, and if there's a leadership vacuum, that's how it manifests itself.
I think it goes beyond simply then the conduct of Fox News or some of the tabloids in New York and so forth, but that corporate culture. I mean, there have been other cases. You, I think, obliquely referenced some of them. The News America Marketing was one, for example, which has been settled since. But shareholders have you know, filed suit about pretty dodgy practice. Perhaps you can, I know, Paul Farhi, perhaps you can briefly explain what happened there last year.
Yes, this was an instance in which a Murdoch subsidiary, a News Corp subsidiary, was attempting to buy and was out a competitor, and the allegation from the competitor was that the News Corp subsidiary had hacked into the phone records of this company, had gained competitive information, and was using it against it. This was settled, but this is, in fact, a thread which American investigators will look into as to whether this corporate practice, if in fact it was a corporate practice, took place in America. This was several years back now. It did not involve a media entity per se. It was a marketing subsidiary.
Although we did see similar questions of corporate hacking come up recently with some of the British holdings. So, you know, this thread of computer hacking now runs through at least two companies. And you have the phone hacking, which there are questions as to whether it did cross the shore and touch on phones that were in the United States. And, you know, there's estimates that all told over 1,100 phones were hacked. So, again, I think we got to be careful about diminishing the size of the speed bump that
Here's my instinct, though, and we don't know what we don't know. It may have gone on, but we have 1,100 known cases of hacking in Great Britain. We have, at this moment, maybe one in America. In other words,
Isn't one enough?
One is plenty, but as a widespread practice, as similar to what went on in Great Britain, so far there's no real comparison. There's nothing at all.
Jess Todtfeld, I mean, the reason I suppose some of this is particularly relevant there is whether it be the journalistic culture in the UK or the corporate culture as regards competitors in the US at the very least. This is all coming from Rupert Murdoch and his attitude. This comes from him. He is actually involved in the day-to-day running of all these entities and so forth. Would you at least accept that?
Yeah, I mean, to a degree. I mean, I would say, of course, he's involved, and he is the leader. And in that little clip that you played just before, I was happy to hear him accepting faults and stepping up like our leader should and taking the blame as the big figurehead. But anybody who's ever worked for a big company knows that the top person, the CEO, is not sitting there for every last meeting and every last discussion. And I'm in no way trying to play down the fact that what happened in the UK was, it was obviously wrong. It was obviously wrong, and it's obviously a big problem for them to deal with. But in terms of him sitting in on every meeting, I don't think so.
Well, not sitting on every meeting.
He's going to step up
how would
like
you characterise it, Jeremy Holden, whether it's actually his relationship to what was going on in the UK or his relationship to some of these underhand corporate practices, alleged corporate practices that were going on here with competitors? I mean, what would you say his relationship was to those things?
Well, I think one of the key comments that the commission said was the willful blindness. And so it's this at best absence of leadership that allowed all these things to happen, where you, again, have 50 people who have been arrested, up to a dozen possibly facing criminal charges. And I think, you look back to Rupert Murdoch's statement that News Corp's #1 asset is the public trust. And to the extent that the company is now becoming synonymous with corruption and hacking and bad journalism, it's a problem that can't be solved by just waiting to get over this one speed bump.
Actually, Paul Farhi, might not be a bad idea to get the context of that. Is this a huge story in the US? Is the public perception of Rupert Murdoch, becoming front and center right now here?
Well, I think the public is not as engaged here as it is in Great Britain, certainly, because Murdoch is a huge figure in the media of Great Britain. He's interwoven in the political culture there in a way that has no real parallel here in the U.S., although he's certainly a big figure here.
We'll get onto that in a moment, actually.
But Jeremy's absolutely right. There is this sense that something is wrong, that something was illegal, and that he presided over this.
Well, let's take a quick look. Well, actually, by definition, it can't be a quick look at News Corp's holdings here in the U.S. They include broadcast, film companies, TV networks, newspapers, magazines. We will begin the list actually now. It begins with 20th Century Fox, Fox Searchlight Pictures, Blue Sky Studios, Fox Television Studios. And it goes on and on and on. In fact, if I carry on reading it, we're not going to have enough time to actually get onto the topic. We might maybe just put it on the screen behind us. But that's just a selection. With all that, though, surely then comes enormous power, Jeremy Holden. What was so interesting about the proceedings in the UK was how closely entwined he was with the political elites of the UK. Is there inevitably a similar relationship here in the US, would you say?
You know, I think during his testimony, I think last week, Rupert Murdoch said that, phone hacking represented a lazy way to do journalism. And I think what we've seen is, at best, a lazy way to lead a multinational company. And I think, the question is, we know that the corruption extends somewhat down the chain of command, as evidenced by the resignations and the criminal charges that may be coming and all the arrests. And I think it opens up a question as to how far down the chain of command does the kind of acceptance of lazy journalism exist.
I think what I was asking though more about was his relationship with political figures in the US and here in Washington, for example. Is there a similar?
There's some parallels, certainly. But what's so extraordinary about this instance in Great Britain is how huge a figure Rupert Murdoch is and how intertwined he is with the political system. He is an absolute kingmaker. His media controls so much of the public attention in a way that, again, doesn't have a parallel in the U.S. That's not to say Rupert Murdoch isn't a big figure in the U.S. He's given millions of dollars to Republicans over the years. He is intertwined with our power structure. It so happens, however, that we are a much bigger pool to play in.
But I mean, he pleads, well, look, it's not really me who's courting politicians, it's politicians who try and court me. I mean, does that happen here as well? I mean, there is some truth to that.
Well, certainly. No conservative wants to be on the wrong side of Fox News. No Republican wants to run afoul of that particular media outlet. But, can Rupert Murdoch make someone president? Unclear. Can Rupert Murdoch make someone prime minister? Quite clear. And
not only do they not want to be on the wrong, do conservative politicians not want to be on the wrong side of Fox News, but we saw reports this week that Fox News is one of the first stops they make when they get into New York, like sometimes in front of.
Do you think this is going to affect investigations into his conduct here? Jess Todtfeld.
One thing that I'm kind of stuck on it and just sitting here thinking about is a comment I made before, a speed bump, and I'll just tell you why I think that this whole thing is a speed bump in this whole lifespan and history of the company. It's because, or at least maybe this is an American point of view, which is if you look at other companies like, say, GE, and they were dumping PCBs in the water, they were able to get past that situation. If you look at Ted Turner, whose big mouth put him in the papers and made him seem unfit, all these companies have been able to get past those, and Americans have short memories.
Actually, I mean that's a really good point.
Things.
I mean, is there a sense that in the end that it makes a difference whether he steps down or not? Because frankly, news and media is still basically controlled by an oligarchy anyway. A select few companies run this. You're not going to get any. I mean, is there going to be any huge divergence or any new vitality and variety in the media just because one man steps down here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I would doubt that. I think News Corp reflects the founder and chairman's political views in certain ways, and if he were to go, Roger Ailes wouldn't change his mind. The editors and reporters of Fox News wouldn't change their points of view, if any, and it might actually even be not a material change.
I mean, in that sense, then, Jeremy, I mean, from your point of view, then, is this all a bit hopeless? I mean, do things seem to be going in the right direction or not for you, who has been a critic not only of concentration of media ownership, but also of Mr. Murdoch in particular?
I think we're taking steps in the right direction in terms of finally asking these questions. I mean, the issue of phone hacking has been simmering for years. You know, we talked about a settlement that several years ago that related to you know, computer hacking with News Corp-related entities. So I think the fact that the attention is being paid on the culture and the behavior says that we're moving in the right direction. The fact that Senator Rockefeller is looking into whether these issues have crossed the seas and come, you know, to our shores, it continues that conversation moving in the right direction. But to the extent that we look at this as the committee has put out his report, let's have a conversation and move on, that could derail the process of kind of cleaning out the rot and seeing how deep it goes.
Jeremy Holden, thank you very much. Paul Farhi of the Washington Post, thank you. Jess Todtfeld in New York, thank you as well. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.